Hey everyone, it's Brandon Sterling with Safe Haven Portfolio Management. You can find my website at safe-havenco.com. I'm Safe Haven, PMA on Telegram. Lots of unlisted videos are on there. So over the last year, I've had people reach out who have received PMAs from people online. And some of the names of the associations these people give you include a description like a faith-based organization PMA, a 501A free church PMA, a private spiritual church ministerial association. What a word mashup on that last one. So I find it interesting on that last one that the creator of this formatting, they formatted the wording that way. It's like they're trying to cover as many bases as possible or something. So it's definitely wordy, confusing, I think by design. And to me, that's a little bit shady. So now an important foundation that Clint and I have shown in my last 508C1A video is that a 508C1A, it's not a structure. It's not an entity or organizational type. It's merely an IRS code. It's a section of the IRS code in clarification for section 501c3. And so a 508c1a, the 508c1a exemptions cannot exist without first being a 501c3 existing. So, and now no true church should use the 508 IRS code as the source of this legal authority anyways. And no PMA should claim its existence in legal authority with the tax code. And so that's not a true PMA. You just made your association public. And so no PMA should have an EIN either. Now, my model, we certainly do not get EINs for the PMA. Why would you have your association have a bank account, a private membership association? I mean, you guys should look at Title 12. This is the USC Title 12. It's the banking regulations. I mean, it's so vast. I mean, it's so many regulations inside of this code. And so you don't want a PMA exposed to all that. And I certainly don't want to expose to the banking liabilities. So what is a church? Well, if you're a Christian, hopefully you know it's not an IRS code or documents. It's, of course, the body of Christ. Well, what does the IRS consider a church? Because we need to look through the lens of the IRS and see how they scrutinize an organization to see if they're actually a church or not. And so when the IRS looks into structures that qualifies a legitimate church, they work off our criteria that's called the 14-point criteria. And so the first one is going to be a distinct legal existence. And again, since a 508 is just a subsection of the 501 code, that's not a legal existence. So number two thing that they look for is a definite and distinct ecclesiastical government. The third thing they look for is a formal code of doctrine and discipline. The fourth thing they look for is a distinct religious history. The fifth thing they look for is membership not associated with any other church or denomination. So you got to have a set denomination. Number six is organization of ordained ministers. The seventh thing they look for is ordained ministers selected after completing prescribed courses of study. And then 8 is literature of its own. So the ninth thing they look for is an established place of worship. And then number 10 is going to be regular congregations. And they're really looking for weekly congregations. And so the 11th thing is regular religious services. The 12th thing they look for, or I'm actually out of order, this is 13. Sunday schools for the religious instruction of the young. And then the last 14th point they look for is schools for the preparation of its members. So now I want to get into some past rulings on, how they scrutinize organizations. So one of them is the case that's called De La Salle Institute versus United States. So I'm going to share my screen real quick. Okay, so now this one, the plaintiff was trying to say they had a tax exempt status when they actually didn't. And so they're trying to get a refund. Okay, so this was another nonprofit, looks like they're in Philadelphia, and they declared themselves as a church for tax purposes. But the IRS, they scrutinized this organization. They came to found that, again, they were using this whole nonprofit status as a tax shelter, and they were improperly using it. Just like these 508 gurus, they tell you how to misuse a nonprofit, and they actually don't even set you up with a proper nonprofit. And we'll get into that later. They didn't pass the 14-point check list that I was just going over. This American Guidance Foundation, it was concluded by the IRS that they weren't conducting regular congregations. And so they did not get the tax exempt status. They were not a church. Now, another one is Spiritual Outreach Society versus Commissioner. Yeah, these guys, they claim to be having a nonprofit for religious purposes, but, they didn't have a set denomination. They broke all sorts of the 14 points that the IRS looks for. They didn't have a lot of those things again. So, here's another example of a ministry, a church, let's say. And see, here we go. They list the 14 points that I just listed earlier. So they didn't meet the criteria that the IRS looks for. So the tax court ruled against this organization because it found that these guys, they failed to fulfill an associational requirement and certain factual requirements. And so their membership can constitute a congregation for purposes of the Internal Revenue Code, just as surely as a membership that assembles at least weekly for group services led by a minister. Now, I have something that will really blow the 508 PMA out of the water. Again, a lot of the 508 C1A paperwork that people get describes their structure as a church. Well, in American Guidance Foundation, Inc. versus US, the court said that at a minimum, a church must include a body of believers that assemble regularly in order to worship. And so it must also be reasonably available to the public. You might want to think about that again. Reasonably available to the public. This is what they're saying true church has to be. So in its conduct of worship, in its educational instruction, in its promulgation of doctrine. And so what they're telling you is, and this is from the case that I just showed you guys, this is their words, not mine, you have to be reasonably available to the public. So what about that is private? How can you have a PMA that has to be available to the public? That counters everything that these 508 gurus talk about. And so it's funny because since last year, I've seen these same gurus that push living in the private now holding Zoom church services, because some of them, there's only a couple that figured out what they were doing was using a PMA, but then they're claiming it was a church when it wasn't actually a church. And so the whole thing is just so disingenuous. And so they're LARPing to be a church because they're scared of the 14-point check that the IRS does that I went over. They're scared that they'll fail it. And then if you fail it, then you're going to get audited if they haven't already, right? And so you're putting up, these guys, they're putting up a facade, and they're not worshiping God with good faith intentions. They're putting on a show because they're scared that, they're going to get audited. So how is that private? Their decisions are being led by the IRS regulation. The church has to be openly available to the public. That's not a private membership association. You know, in the Bible, in Matthew 8, it says not to pray in public, but to pray in private. And so then the court also noted that the IRS has developed, you know, the 14 points I described earlier that they use to see if you're a church or just calling yourself one to be a tax shelter, which is a lot of cases with these 508 people. They're really using it as a way that they think is going to get out of taxes. But I'll actually show you something later that it doesn't get you out of taxes. They have you file for an EIN so you can open a bank account, but some of them have you do it in a really wonky way. They say, because normal people applying for an EIN, you just apply on the IRS website. It takes like 5 minutes. It's super easy to get. But these 508 gurus are telling you that you have to print it out, you know, write certain things. I think some of them even like stamp, you know, this is a 508 on the paperwork. And they tell you to fax it to the IRS or even mail it. Some of these guys are telling you to mail it and then call the IRS and talk to them and, you know, try to establish that you're a 508. And so they tell you that if you do all this, your EIN will be for a 508 only. But, you know, somebody actually shared their EIN letter that they got following the process that the 508 people do. So this is the bottom portion. I'm not going to include the top because of personal information. But yeah, this is, you know, on the EIN letter that they got after following this supposed 508 process. And so, as you can see, you know, they said, hey, you submitted your application for an EIN. You checked the box indicating you're a nonprofit organization. Assigning an EIN does not grant tax-exempt status to nonprofit organizations. Publication 557, tax-exempt status for your organization, has details on the application process, as well as information on returns you may need to file. To apply for recognition of tax-exempt status, organizations must include or complete an application on one of the following forms. Form 1023, application for recognition of exemption under section 501c3. Where does this say anywhere about, hey, if you're a 508, you're automatically exempt? It doesn't say that anywhere on this letter because, of course, as we know, a 508c1a does not exist as a structure. It does not exist as a nonprofit organization. It's just a subsection, a clarification of section 501c3. And here, I can't disagree with the IRS here. Hate to say it, but I mean, they're just following their own code, which anyone can read. So yeah, and so that blows the whole narrative out of the water with these 508 gurus because they tell you, well, if you're a 508c1a, you're automatically exempt. You don't have to apply for a tax-exempt status. You know, here's just some further evidence of, you know, whoever is participating in this 508c1a thing, whether you know it or not, whether, you know, you bought this thing from a guru or you're the guru that's watching this right now, you are perpetuating a fraud and you are defrauding people that pay for a 508. You know, these poor people, they pay thousands of dollars for a fraudulent set of documents and a fraudulent idea of a PMA. You know, these 508 gurus want to hide this, right? Like how do they expect people to not read this after they get the EIN letter? A lot of people don't, but some people have figured it out and they reached out to me and they said, hey, and so I wanted to show you guys this because, you know, they're either lying to their people or they know it's a fraud and they just don't care because they just want to collect thousands of dollars. So it's really too bad that it's going on, but it's so prevalent right now. Last summer, I was calling out how a 508 is not a PMA. So now another thing is it's important to know the key differences between churches and other religious organizations. Organizations, you know, these can include non-denominational ministries, interdenominational, all sorts of these. And so the principal purpose of these organizations is the study or advancement of religion. And this is an IRS publication 1828, page 5. And so on page 7 on this IRS publication, it says that unlike churches, religious organizations that want tax-exempt status must apply to the IRS to get that status unless they receive under $5,000 per year. Okay, so that's another thing that these 508 people are pushing. They say, "Oh, we're not a church. We're a 508 ministerial organization." And there's a couple other ways they word it, but that's basically how they pitch it. But here in plain text, in the IRS publication I just cited, it says that you're not automatically exempt. And so these gurus are saying that you are as a religious organization. So that's another false thing being pushed out there. So now another thing that's in this publication, it says a religious organization is under the authority of a religious body that is a church. So that blows other gurus' narratives out of the water, because they say, "Oh, well, we're not a church. We're an organization." But you can't have the organization without a church, because some of them have figured out, "Oh, wait, I can't be a church without 501c3. And so that's how they trick even more people. But here again, that's a fraud as well. And so in IRS publication 1828, it clearly says faith-based ministries, organizations, and associations do not fall under or qualify for mandatory tax exemption status. Notice how I said associations, right? So you can't say that you're a faith-based association and also claim tax exempt status. That's not how that works. Again, the tax exemption is only for churches that meet the requirements of section 501c3. So, look up Human Understanding versus United States. And this was in the Court of Federal Claims. And it goes over everything I've covered pretty much. And so if you want your organization to be tax exempt, you have to apply to become a 501c3 within 27 months of starting your organization. And so in Universal Life Church, Inc. versus the United States, the court found that the plaintiff's tax-exempt status was not legitimate. And this group actually was giving tax and tax-related information to its members. Does that sound familiar, guys? Does that sound like these 508 people to you? And it's funny that these 508 people at the bottom of their website say, "Hey, this is not tax or legal advice. Please seek a professional." So maybe some of them are aware of this past case, and so they're trying to hedge themselves out. But even that won't work, because they're giving tax and tax-related information while claiming they're a ministry or a church. Again, that doesn't fall under 501c3 purposes. Some of these 508 gurus have already figured out the whole 508 thing is a fraud. So they changed their organizational structure to a 501c3, and now they abide to the 14 points that can fall under this non-exempt activity. And so whenever you have a ministry case like this with the IRS, they're going to first see, okay, is this person, is it even under proper tax exempt status? Saying you're 508 is like shouting out in an empty void. I mean, no one's going to hear you or care what you're saying. So they're going to see you as a taxpayer, because this whole 508 thing, again, it doesn't exist. And you're trying to use a religious structure to launder money and evade taxes. And so the IRS and the tax court, they'll scrutinize your banking records, and they'll see if you personally have benefited from any of the ministry's funds, and they'll review that you have not been operating as a 501c3. And in this case, since the plaintiff was giving tax advice to people, that wasn't a legitimate ministerial purpose. Now, I've even seen some of these groups even claim that a 508c1a not only is tax exempt automatically, which by now we know it's a lie, but they'll even say sometimes that donors can write off their donations to the 508 in the donator's taxes. And so this is just so obviously frivolous. In order for a donor to write off a donation on their taxes, they have to get a receipt and verify with the IRS that you have a 501c3 tax exemption status that's in good standing. And so if you don't, and you told your donors that their funds are going to be a write-off, then when the donor goes to claim this to the IRS as a write-off, your 508, your organization will be immediately on the IRS radar. And this is an easy way to get audited. And that's how a lot of these cases that I presented earlier got caught in the fraud that they were pushing. And so another thing I see in the 508 paperwork is that the trustee in this 508 PMA, in the paperwork, it says the trustee claims an oath of poverty. And this oath of poverty basically just means that they will not derive personal income from the church or the ministry, and they'll give up all their possessions to the church other than the bare necessities of life. And their religious order then provides their food, clothing, and shelter, but little more than that. And so there are many IRS cases on this whole vow of poverty thing, and a lot of people use the vow of poverty to hide what they're actually doing, and they're using it as a tax scam. And so this has been going on for quite a while. And the IRS in their assessment period, they calculate the cost of your lifestyle, and they can do that by local demographics of where you are, and then they'll measure that against what you're reporting or not reporting. And then they can see that you're just using the church as a tax shelter. And so they call this what's called a lifestyle profile assessment. And so paying your personal bills with the church or ministry money cannot be construed as a charitable contribution. You can't just charitably give to your own organization and then pay your bills with it. And so that won't fit the legal criteria. And so this is a violation of the legal requirements for being and maintaining a tax-exempt status under 501c3, and the IRS considers this an abusive donation arrangement. It says, no part of the net earnings of which inures to the benefit of any private shareholder or individual. And so using your family expenses to be paid by church or ministry funds, that's tax fraud. The vow of poverty, when you claim that, that's heavily scrutinized. And in the cases, the past cases that I cited earlier, you can read that they'll even pick apart monks' vows of poverty, and they'll still scrutinize them when all the monks have are robes and books. I mean, they have nothing, right? So what makes people think that even having a normal lifestyle and having the church pay for it won't be scrutinized? And so it's horrible that the IRS does this, but you have to know the consequences of all of these things, especially the vow of poverty, and especially claiming that you're a church or a ministry. And so we've seen this vow of poverty fail on in tax court time and time again, especially if you're the creator of the church or the ministry or the organization, and then you take the vow of poverty, but then you're abusing the church money for your personal benefit. Again, you're going to be heavily scrutinized. And so in IRS publication 517, only ordained ministers may receive a housing allowance. And this can sometimes be called a parsonage allowance. You know, when the pastor, has a house that's on the church property, we know that as the parsonage, right? So they have something called the parsonage allowance or rental allowance. And this is excludable from gross income for income tax purposes, but not for self-employment tax purposes. This is only applicable for 501c3s since 508s do not exist. And so Another myth peddled by these 508 gurus is that the FBO, the faith-based organization or church, operates under canon law. And again, that's in some of your guys' 508 paperwork that I've seen. And they claim that since they operate under canon law, they're not under the jurisdiction of any place. They say that they're not under the civil law jurisdiction a lot of times in this paperwork that you guys get. That's another lie. And the case law I presented earlier, it demonstrates past rulings on that whole claim that you operate on canon law and is outside of jurisdiction. That's false. You are still under civil law jurisdiction. Doesn't matter if you claim canon law or not, or anything. So with all that said, I mean, that's really just a mountain of evidence that this whole 508 scam is a scam. It's just the truth, especially if you claim to be doing God's work. I mean, it's just so disingenuous. So anyways, just because somebody calls themselves in ministry or whatever, doesn't mean they have good intentions. In fact, most of the time, after what we've seen, they're wolves hiding in sheep's clothing.